Summer, 1940. Nazi Germany ruled the skies, and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring mocked America with a sneer. When President Roosevelt declared the United States would build 50,000 planes a year, Göring burst out laughing. To him, it was madness, an empty boast from a weak nation of consumers. But the laughter would not last. Within a few short years, America unleashed the greatest industrial miracle in history. Factories turned out bombers by the hour, women filled the assembly lines, and the sky became a thunderstorm of American engines. Not 50,000, but 100,000 planes rolled off the lines, enough to crush the Luftwaffe, shatter German industry, and turn Göring's arrogance into bitter silence. This is the story of the moment Nazi Germany underestimated America and paid the ultimate price. Göring's laughter and America's bold promise. In the summer of 1940, when Nazi Germany seemed invincible, the Luftwaffe stood as one of the most feared military forces on Earth. The German Air Force had spearheaded Hitler's lightning campaigns across Europe, crushing Poland, smashing through France, and hammering Britain in the skies. Its commander, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, basked in the glory of his apparent triumphs. A decorated fighter ace of the First World War and Hitler's closest confidant, Göring had built the Luftwaffe into a symbol of Nazi power. He exuded arrogance, strutting in his extravagant uniforms, bedecked with medals and jewels, convinced that the air war was his personal domain. To Göring, the United States of America was a sleeping giant, far away and largely irrelevant to the struggles of Europe. He saw America as a land of consumers, movie stars, and businessmen, not warriors. Its army was small, its air force tiny compared to his, and its people still hesitant to involve themselves in another European war. For Göring, the Luftwaffe represented years of careful planning and mobilization, while the Americans had barely begun to think in terms of military aviation. It was against this backdrop that President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a stunning declaration. In May 1940, as France was collapsing under the German onslaught, Roosevelt gave a speech in which he proclaimed that the United States must produce 50,000 planes per year. At the time, this figure seemed almost fantastical. America's aircraft industry was modest. In all of 1939, the country had produced fewer than 3,000 military planes. Even the most optimistic engineers and industrialists wondered how the nation could leap from a few thousand per year to 50,000. To Roosevelt, however, the number was not just a figure. It was a statement of intent. The United States, he declared, must become the great arsenal of democracy. The free world depended on America's ability to supply weapons, especially aircraft, to those fighting against Nazi tyranny. Britain, battered and nearly alone, desperately needed fighters and bombers to survive. Roosevelt believed that only American industry, with its vast resources, manpower, and technical know-how, could meet that demand. When news of Roosevelt's proclamation reached Berlin, Hermann Göring reacted with contempt. He scoffed at the very idea. To him, the notion that America could simply will itself into producing such enormous numbers of aircraft was laughable. Göring reportedly laughed out loud when he heard the figure, dismissing it as political rhetoric. He told colleagues that America's capitalists would never sacrifice their profits to meet such a target, that their assembly lines for refrigerators and automobiles could not simply be turned into factories for warplanes. Germany, he insisted, had been preparing for years. America, he claimed, could never catch up. Many around the world agreed with him. In Britain, some doubted Roosevelt's promise. Even within the United States, critics questioned whether such an industrial leap was remotely possible. After all, the United States in 1940 was still recovering from the Great Depression. Its military budget was modest, its armed forces ranked 17th in the world, and its political climate remained deeply isolationist. But Göring's arrogance blinded him to two key realities. First, the United States possessed an industrial base unlike any other on Earth. Its automobile industry alone produced millions of cars per year, with highly efficient assembly line techniques perfected by Henry Ford and his rivals. Second, Roosevelt's words were not mere propaganda. He was already setting in motion a mobilization that would harness the full power of American capitalism, labor, and innovation. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Roosevelt administration began ordering aircraft in vast quantities. British contracts for planes flowed to American manufacturers such as Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas. Automobile giants like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were enlisted to begin designing and producing military engines and airframes. Roosevelt's Council of National Defense coordinated with industry leaders to lay the groundwork for mass production. By late 1940, factories that had once produced consumer goods were being retooled to build wings, fuselages, and engines. Airfields were expanded, training programs for pilots and mechanics multiplied, and investment poured into new plants. While to the outside world the change seemed slow, in reality the gears of America's industrial machine were beginning to turn. To Goring, all this seemed insignificant compared to Germany's already vast production lines. The Luftwaffe was producing thousands of aircraft per year, fielding them in combat, and refining their designs under battlefield conditions. He ridiculed Roosevelt's promise as empty bravado, meant to impress an American public still reluctant to embrace war. His laughter echoed in Nazi circles, reinforcing the belief that America was a nation of soft consumers, not hard fighters. But beneath the surface, Goring's arrogance was sowing the seeds of his downfall. He failed to appreciate that when mobilized, America's resources, its manpower, raw materials, factories, and technical expertise, far surpassed anything Germany could hope to match. Roosevelt had challenged his nation with an audacious target, and step by step, industry was beginning to meet it. The Reichsmarschall's mockery would not last. Within just a few years, the laughter would be silenced by the thunder of tens of thousands of American bombers and fighters filling the skies over Europe. What Goring dismissed as impossible would become the very instrument of his Air Force's destruction. The arsenal of democracy comes alive. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed America overnight. Isolationism, which had defined much of U.S. politics during the 1930s, collapsed in a single morning. Now, the nation was at war on two fronts, against Japan in the Pacific and against Germany and Italy in Europe. For Roosevelt, the 50,000 plane goal that had once been seen as an ambitious gesture became an urgent necessity. Without overwhelming air power, the Allies could not hope to survive, let alone win. The War Production Board, created in January 1942, became the nerve center of America's industrial mobilization. Headed by Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive, the board coordinated every aspect of the economy: raw materials, labor, factories, and shipping to maximize war output. Civilian production was curtailed. Automobiles, radios, and many consumer goods vanished from store shelves. In their place came tanks, ships, and above all, aircraft. One of the most remarkable achievements was the conversion of the automobile industry. The giants of Detroit, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, had perfected the techniques of mass production in the interwar years. Now those methods were redirected toward building warplanes. The Ford Motor Company constructed the Willow Run plant in Michigan, which became the largest factory under one roof in the world. It was designed specifically to build the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber with a reputation for complexity. Conventional wisdom said it took months to hand-assemble a single B-24. Ford engineers scoffed at that idea and applied their assembly line genius. At its peak, Willow Run produced one fully assembled B-24 every 63 minutes. The numbers were staggering. In 1942, the United States produced 47,836 aircraft, nearly reaching Roosevelt's original target in the very first year of all-out war. By 1943, output nearly doubled, reaching 85,898. And in 1944, the miracle was complete. 96,318 aircraft rolled off American assembly lines in a single year. Fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers poured forth in endless streams. The arsenal of democracy was alive, and its roar could be heard around the world. This transformation was not simply mechanical. It was social. With millions of men drafted into the armed forces, the labor shortage was filled by women. They became the riveters, welders, and machinists who kept the factories humming day and night. Rosie the Riveter, the cultural icon with her rolled-up sleeve and the slogan "We can do it," captured the spirit of an America where women proved themselves indispensable to victory. Everywhere, the pace was relentless. Boeing in Seattle expanded to build the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress, the bomber that would hammer German cities. Douglas Aircraft produced the versatile C-47 transport, which would carry paratroopers into Normandy. North American aviation perfected the P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter that would escort Allied bombers deep into Germany and finally shatter the Luftwaffe. Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, and Wright Aeronautical produced engines by the tens of thousands. Even companies that had nothing to do with aviation before the war, such as refrigerator and typewriter manufacturers, became subcontractors for the aircraft industry. The sheer scale defied belief. By 1944, there were over 1.3 million Americans employed in aircraft production. New towns sprang up around the factories. Railroads delivered endless supplies of aluminum, steel, and rubber. Assembly lines ran around the clock, 7 days a week. The United States was not just catching up, it was pulling so far ahead that no Axis power could hope to match it. In Berlin, reports of America's production figures filtered in. At first, Goring and the Nazi leadership dismissed them as propaganda. But as captured American aircraft appeared in ever greater numbers in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually over occupied Europe, the reality became undeniable. Luftwaffe pilots who had once enjoyed overwhelming superiority now found themselves facing swarms of Allied planes. For every German fighter downed, 2 more Allied aircraft seemed to arrive in its place. The Luftwaffe had reached its production peak at about 40,000 planes per year. Japan managed even less. Both powers were constrained by raw material shortages, limited factory capacity, and constant Allied bombing. Meanwhile, America was producing twice that number annually, and shipping them across oceans in convoys that were increasingly protected by American-built escort carriers and destroyers. The consequences were visible on the battlefield. In 1942, American P-40 Warhawks and B-25 Mitchell bombers entered the deserts of North Africa, tipping the balance against the Afrika Korps. In 1943, B-17s and B-24s began daylight bombing raids over Germany itself, striking factories, shipyards, and oil refineries. Losses were heavy at first, but by late 1943 and early 1944, the tide shifted. With the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, escort fighters could accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, German cities, industries, and fuel supplies were within constant reach. For Goring, this was the nightmare he had once dismissed with laughter. He had boasted that no enemy bomb would ever fall on Berlin. By 1943, those words rang hollow as American and British bombers reduced the German capital to rubble. He had ridiculed Roosevelt's claim of 50,000 planes, insisting that America's soft population could not sustain such an effort. Yet the numbers spoke for themselves. By the middle of the war, America was producing more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was straining to survive. Its pilots were among the finest in the world, but they were too few, and their replacements too inexperienced to stem the tide. Training programs were shortened. Fuel shortages crippled flight hours. Aircraft losses mounted faster than factories could replace them. By 1943, the laughter that had echoed in Berlin had long since faded. Goring began to see the truth that Roosevelt had known from the start. America's industrial might, once mobilized, was unstoppable. The arsenal of democracy was not just a slogan. It was a weapon of war more powerful than any single gun or tank. And it was a weapon that would grind down the Luftwaffe until nothing remained but wreckage on the ground and silence in the skies. 100,000 planes and the fall of Goring's dream. By 1944, the United States had achieved the impossible. The nation that in 1939 had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft a year was now building close to 100,000 annually. From 1940 to 1945, more than 300,000 planes rolled off American assembly lines. Fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers in a variety and quantity that dwarfed anything the Axis could imagine. The target that had once made Hermann Göring laugh, the goal of 50,000 planes, was not just met. It was obliterated. The sheer numbers told only part of the story. Behind each aircraft stood an industrial ecosystem unmatched in human history. The Willow Run plant alone built more than 8,600 B-24 Liberators. Boeing factories produced 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses. North American aviation turned out over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. the long-range fighter that would escort Allied bombers deep into the heart of Germany. Douglas aircraft constructed thousands of C-47 Skitrans, which carried paratroopers into Normandy and supplied advancing armies across Europe. These planes were not just hardware, they were strategic instruments. With overwhelming production, the Allies could fight a war of attrition that the Axis could not hope to sustain. Every time a bomber was lost over the Ruhr or Berlin, another waited in England to take its place. Every time a fighter squadron was wiped out in combat, new pilots arrived in new machines to continue the fight. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was bleeding dry. Its factories, already strained, were bombed relentlessly. Its fuel supplies dwindled as synthetic oil plants were targeted and destroyed. Its pilots, once the most experienced in the world, were replaced by teenagers with minimal training. For Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal who had once promised Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on Berlin, the reality by 1944 was devastating. American bombers filled the skies in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. The P-51 Mustangs, with their drop tanks and deadly firepower, swept the Luftwaffe from the air. German fighter pilots, who once enjoyed the upper hand, now faced overwhelming odds. Many never returned from missions, cut down in battles they could no longer win. The turning point came during operations like Big Week in February 1944. Over the course of 7 days, the U.S. 8th Air Force and the Royal Air Force launched massive raids against Germany's aircraft industry. Dozens of factories were hit, crippling production. Though American losses were high, the Luftwaffe suffered worse, losing hundreds of irreplaceable fighters and veteran pilots. From that point on, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. By mid-1944, the skies belonged to the Allies. In June, during Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, German troops on the beaches of Normandy fought under a sky dominated by American and British planes. Goring's Air Force, once the terror of Europe, could barely mount a response. On the ground, German soldiers bitterly joked that if they saw a plane in the sky, it was Allied. If they saw two, it was American. The Luftwaffe, which had once embodied Nazi might, had been broken by the industrial avalanche Goring had mocked. The devastation extended beyond the battlefield. German cities lay in ruins. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin were bombed again and again by fleets of American B-17s and B-24s, escorted by swarms of P-51s. Strategic targets, oil refineries, rail yards, factories, were systematically destroyed. By late 1944, the Reich was running on fumes. Tanks sat idle for lack of fuel. Aircraft remained grounded. Supply lines collapsed. In Berlin, Goring became increasingly irrelevant. Once Hitler's most trusted lieutenant, he was sidelined as his Luftwaffe failed to protect the Reich. His boasts had turned to ashes. The laughter with which he had greeted Roosevelt's promise of 50,000 planes had long since faded. Now he sat in his headquarters, watching reports of relentless Allied bombing raids, powerless to stop them. The Reichsmarshal who had once strutted in silks and jewels now faced the collapse of his life's work. The final irony came at the end of the war. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered, Goring attempted to position himself as Hitler's successor. Instead, he was arrested by American troops. At the Nuremberg trials, stripped of his power and confronted with the evidence of his crimes, Goring was a broken man. He remained defiant in words, but his authority was gone. The Luftwaffe he had promised would dominate Europe had been annihilated by the very industrial force he had once dismissed. The lesson of Goring's laughter remains one of history's starkest warnings. In 1940, he saw America as weak, disorganized, and incapable of rapid mobilization. In reality, America's democratic system, its vast resources, and its culture of innovation proved far more powerful than Nazi arrogance. Roosevelt's proclamation of 50,000 planes was not a boast, it was a challenge, one that galvanized the nation into unprecedented action. By the time the war ended, the United States had built not just 50,000 planes, but hundreds of thousands. Those aircraft secured the skies, enabled the invasions of Europe and the Pacific, and delivered the final blows to Hitler's regime. Goring's laughter, once a symbol of Nazi confidence, stands today as a reminder of the dangers of underestimating free nations when they commit themselves fully to survival. In the end, Roosevelt had been right. America was the arsenal of democracy, and in that arsenal, the roar of 100,000 engines silenced the laughter of Hermann Göring forever.